So the 2000s were right around 20 years ago at this point, and that's a little bit jarring for me. That would have been around the time that I first moved away from home and kind of moved up to Columbus, and in between going to school and working my job at the mall, I spent a whole lot of time playing games during that time period. So today what I wanted to do is revisit some of those personal favorites from the 2000s, and I should point out that all of these run really well on the Steam Deck, and they're all natively purchasable within the Steam ecosystem. Now I thought about doing just like, fun games from the 2000s to emulate, but honestly that seemed kind of overwhelming because there's pretty much an endless amount of games that you can emulate on the deck. So for now I figured, maybe I'll do that in a future video, but for now all these games are, games that you can just look up on the Steam store right now. So all that being said, let's just go ahead and kick this off with one of my personal favorites that's kind of an arcade classic that I believe actually came out around 1999, but it didn't come to the Dreamcast until 2000, and you can get it on PC now, and that is Crazy Taxi. And again, technically this game hit the arcades in 1999, but personally I played this mostly on the Dreamcast, which didn't come out until 2000, so I am cheating a little bit here, but only in the interest of keeping the love for Crazy Taxi alive. And I know I've mentioned this game in videos before, but it still provides some great over-the-top arcade action. The premise is simple: you pick your cabbie, then drive like a maniac, and cruise all over town looking for fares. They're color-coded by difficulty, and depending on your game mode, you'll be racing the clock to get your passengers to their destination in the shortest amount of time possible to try and keep upping your high score. The physics are completely wonky, the soundtrack is awesome with a range of tracks from The Offspring and Bad Religion, and it was a staple of arcades in the early 2000s before those kind of started fading out of fashion before getting a resurgence thanks to barcades popping up everywhere in the modern age. In short, it's loud, garish fun, and it runs great on the Steam Deck for the most part. And I say for the most part because you will see the occasional visual glitches in the distance, but that's more of an issue with the PC port of the game than any shortcoming of the deck hardware. Now I suppose you could technically emulate the Dreamcast version of this on the deck, since that's the version that most people held to be the best right next to the arcade original, but personally I don't need Crazy Taxi to look stellar to have a great time with it, so if that's what you're looking for, it's still a perfectly fine way to play it in my book. Next up, moving forward to 2004/2014, because this is actually a remaster of the original version from 2004, would be Fabled Anniversary. Now I was a little hesitant jumping back into Fable because I wasn't sure how well the original would hold up, and it had been just about 20 years since I'd played it. And while it is certainly showing its age, I have to say it's still pretty enjoyable for what it is. Fable kicks off with you playing as a young boy on your sister's birthday. After a tragic bandit attack on your village, you'll narrowly escape after being rescued by an old hero, who then recruits you to also be trained as a hero at the Heroes Guild. The years roll on, and in no time at all you'll be taking on quests and blazing your own trail as either a force for good or evil if you choose, because the morality system in Fable is one of its hallmark features. I still think it sort of falls into that trap of extremes where you're either a saint or an absolute scoundrel, but occasionally I do appreciate that not every choice you make is so clear-cut when you're making it. Combat is fun, if not particularly exceptional, but this is a classic example of a game being better than the sum of its parts. There are definitely some visual improvements in this version over the original, along with some other quality of life features, but there are still some camera issues and dated design elements that are on display. And even though it's technically open world, I guess, it's still pretty segmented, so you can expect to hit a lot of loading screens. But still, Fable can definitely scratch that fantasy itch with some dreamy, storybook-like qualities about it, and the writing and voice acting is pretty hilarious. Performance on deck is smooth even at max settings in this 2014 remaster, so if you're looking for a callback to a simpler time for the genre, Fable's still worth exploring today. Next up, moving away from high fantasy and firmly within the realm of science fiction, would be 2007's Lost Planet: Extreme Condition. From Capcom, Lost Planet is a third-person shooter that dropped way back in January 2007 as a 360 exclusive initially. I picked it up day one and loved it back then, and then I promptly forgot about it as the years rolled on, and sadly never got a chance to play its follow-ups. Lost Planet takes place in TC-80, which is 80 years before the Trial Century. Humanity has attempted to colonize the planet EDN-3 after Earth's conditions became too hostile for human survival. Unfortunately, it's packed with an aggressive, territorial alien species named the Acrid, which create their own thermal energy. And after a long, hard-fought battle where humanity gets absolutely wrecked by the Acrid, civilian colonists and military personnel continue to live out nomadically as snow pirates looking for thermal energy to take from the Acrid. The story's kinda convoluted and just okay in my book, but the core action of taking down snowbugs is a lot of fun, and I was genuinely surprised at how well it's held up as a game that's nearly 15 years old at this point. I really enjoyed the gameplay mechanics of managing the thermal energy that you absorb from the bugs in your suit, because it becomes this delicate balancing act of making sure that your suit is powered up to combat the cold, which sort of lends the whole gameplay loop a sense of urgency without getting too annoying for the most part. Plus, periodically piloting a giant mech suit is pretty much always a good time, even if it's not especially deep in terms of the attack options at your disposal. disposal. You can hold up to 2 guns at once and some grenades, and that's about it. There's also some light platforming thanks to your grapple hook, and it's legitimately fun in an arcadey sort of way, although I will say that the checkpoints can be kind of unforgiving, and after I got knocked off a cliff in the first level I had to start all over again, which wouldn't be so bad except there's not a sprint button, so it can have a slightly sluggish quality to it. But still, if you just want to blast some bugs in an Arctic adventure, it should serve you pretty well, and for the most part it runs at a solid 60 FPS, even at max settings. Next up, moving up a couple of years to 2009, would be the very stylized and minimalist, but I hesitate to call shooter, but it is a first-person game, Mirror's Edge. Now, I've always had a soft spot for Mirror's Edge. It wasn't the best game I've ever played or anything, but it was really refreshing to see EA coming out with something new and different right around the same time that they dropped Dead Space. But this first-person parkour game paired a fun concept with a brilliant minimalist aesthetic that still looks really gorgeous today. It wasn't everyone's cup of tea, but as someone who's a big fan of exactly this sort of aesthetic, it's an easy game to jump into periodically, no pun intended. It's also pretty crazy that so many of Fate's actions can be performed using predominantly the left trigger and bumper for intuitively performing the upward and downward actions like leaping, diving, or coiling. Now, the combat isn't nearly as fun as the parkour mechanics, but thankfully most of your time will be spent performing traversal, and while it can be tricky to piece together the puzzle of where to jump and which action to perform, when it all clicks into place it feels really satisfying, and there are some legitimately thrilling moments as you dodge, slide, and propel yourself to a narrow escape from a bunch of goons that are chasing you. Now, this might be a case of at least some style over substance, but ultimately it's still a gratifying experience and one that's a lot of fun to revisit as an older title that, well, literally runs great on modern hardware. Don't get me wrong, there's definitely a learning curve associated with Mirror's Edge, but as long as you're willing to stick with it, it does still provide some really satisfying gameplay even in the modern age. And finally, while we're on the subject of great traversal, next up, also from 2009, is Prototype. I remember playing, but not quite beating this back in the day when it first launched on the 360, weirdly close to the launch of Infamous on the PS3, and the two have more than a little bit in common. You'll be playing as Alex Mercer, an amnesia sufferer who's struggling to remember his previous life and how he got his powers. Those powers being long and impressive, including super speed, strength, the ability to straight up absorb people and consume their memories, shape-shifting, turning parts of your body in increments of bladed or melee chaos, and while not technically flight, he wall runs, jumps, and glides with such ease that it's hard not to compare him to Spider-Man. Although it would be more appropriate to think of the Hulk from Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction, which really makes total sense considering Radical Entertainment also made that game as I recall, so it's only natural that a lot of that game's DNA would show up here in another open-world action free-for-all. Story-wise, Alex is on a mission of vengeance, chiefly to get his revenge on whoever's responsible for turning him into this monster. But along the way you'll also be on a mission to stop the spread of a horrible virus, which has overrun Manhattan, and have run-ins with the US Marine Corps, Special Forces units, and naturally some violent monsters. I don't know that I really got that invested in the story here, but the action definitely holds up, even if some of the control decisions are a little bit questionable. But it is undeniably fun having Alex sprint in any direction and be pretty much unstoppable by cars, civilians, helicopters, tanks, gravity. It's almost comically over the top in terms of how capable he is. But while there's no shortage of games that leave you feeling weak and incapable out of the gate only to get stronger later on, Prototype seems to absolutely delight in just throwing off the training wheels almost immediately, and that's still pretty refreshing. On the performance front, it runs rock solid on the deck at max settings. Artistically speaking, it's hardly the prettiest open world game that you could play even for 2009, but it's serviceable enough as a blank canvas that you can sort of paint this chaotic masterpiece of wanton violence on, so if that's your thing, Prototype definitely still delivers. And finally, real quick before we wrap things up, I did want to throw in one honorable mention, or I guess kind of honorable mention, and that would be the Devil May Cry HD collection. Now, I'm not sure if this is the best way to experience it. I've heard some people say that the Switch is the best place to play it, which that seems really weird to me because I would figure the PC version would be right up there. But when it comes to the Steam Deck in particular, this is listed as an unsupported title. However, it did seem to play okay on the Steam Deck. The only weird thing that I encountered was that for some reason the opening videos and videos sprinkled throughout the game are flipped upside down and backwards, and apparently this is a known issue and I don't know if that's ever going to be addressed, but as long as you don't mind that, you can still have a lot of fun with Devil May Cry if you want to play it on the Steam Deck. But again, just based on this fact, I would hesitate to call it the optimal way to play the Devil May Cry trilogy, but it is technically possible, and in the time I spent with it, I still had a really good time. Alright, and that's it for this one. I just wanted to have some fun today and kind of check out some games from the 2000s that I had some fond memories of and see how well they played on the deck, and everything on this list so far has held up quite well. So, what about you? Are there any particular games from the 2000s that you really enjoyed that you've either already played on the deck, or you would just be curious to see if it plays well on the deck? If so, please let me know in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for your time, have an amazing day, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye.